Well, good evening to our families across Europe. I'm really excited to be joined today by my partner and ESM college coach extraordinaire, Josh Davis, joining us from New Orleans. Josh, thanks for being with us today.
Of course. Very, very excited as usual. Get to talk to my boy, Billy.
It's certainly been an interesting year and a half, especially for international students wishing to come to the United States. So we're thankful to have a moment of your time today to talk a little bit about what we believe we've learned from this last cycle and what we essentially think will be the case as students get ready to apply over the next couple of cycles due to COVID, travel restrictions, changing dynamics of higher education here in the United States. And so we're just going to sort of start with a little bit of background. And so, Josh, I think what would be helpful for folks, especially those who are applying to the US for the first time, is maybe just, set the stage. What did we see this year in terms of, number of applicants from overseas, in particular Europe, and then talk through sort of what you saw in terms of colleges setting the expectation that they were going to take international kids into their freshman classes.
Okay. I always want to give a little bit more context, right? So if we just look back to the last 5 years, even looking before the pandemic, there's been constantly trends that may or may not have affected how many kids apply, right? So going back to when the UK, increased school fees for universities, right? And then all of a sudden made people go like, oh, like the US is now financially even, more of an option than it was, previously, especially relative to like going to university in London, if you grew up in Europe, right? And then it was Brexit. And Brexit, how is that going to impact not just schools, but, international students around Europe, and if they want to come to the UK. And again, the US is just sitting there like, hey, we're still an option. And even with the pandemic, it's very, very, very clear that the US is still an attractive option. Despite what happens politically over here, people still want to come here, right? And there's many reasons why. For one, obviously, we know that students are the focus when you go to a US school. In the UK, it's more to prepare you for your career. The US, it's more to really help the student, the young person, figure out who they are, who they want to ultimately be, and whether or not that's the career direction or just exploration. It's going to be the stepping stone towards their I don't want to say future success necessarily, but the decisions that lead to success. And yeah, even through the pandemic, despite students not being able to visit campuses, pretty much for a year plus, despite admissions officers not being able to come to the UK and to Europe to, market their schools and really promote their brands and whatnot, we still saw a major uptick in applications, right? We still saw schools very proudly saying, a school like Notre Dame, 48% of their kids are either international or students of color, right? So even pushing for diversity. So at a time when you thought schools could be like, okay, let's reassess and kind of be more, go down this route, this path, they said, we're going to take more applications, we're going to read more applications, and we're going to keep going on this trend of diversifying our student body, right? That was one of the major takeaways. And especially as they got super, super selective, or even more selective, you could, it's tough for an admissions officer to go through all these numbers of applications, but they were able to really build basically the class that they wanted. It's like, hey, we can build the class that we really, really want now moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Josh, that's probably very spot on. And, on the slide now, we see just an example of selective universities across the United States and exactly what their applicant pool looked like. UCLA leading the way with 139,000 applications, but even places like Northeastern, which has been a popular destination for a lot of international kids, reaching 75,000 applications, and even small private remote universities like Middlebury, taking 11,000. A lot of families might say, gosh, 11,000 doesn't seem like that money, that many applicants. But when you sort of take into consideration, they're only going to accept a few hundred students, you start to see how competitive the landscape is. And I think, Josh, the other point that you made that I think is really well taken is from the United States perspective, we have continued to see those schools want international students, students who are living abroad, whether they be expats, whether they be full traditional international students requiring a visa. That's part of their diversification. So certainly really interesting. Josh, would love your take now on, we obviously hear the most competitive schools, especially when we're working with students in places like London or Munich or Athens or whatever. You hear families come to you and say, "Well, what about Stanford? What about Columbia?" Talk a little bit about what you saw with the admissions rate. We've put them up on the screen here just so people have context to just how competitive these places are. But for example, like at Stanford, Josh, break down the 4% because it's not really 4%. It's probably even more competitive.
Yeah, I mean, we don't want to be the pessimistic people here in the room, right? It's important to have the statistical context. Okay, so 4% is the overall acceptance rate. And again, Stanford is one of the schools that doesn't really publicize their common data set, that they're a little more secretive about it. So we'll use Columbia as the example. Columbia, 4% acceptance rate, right? Early decision plus regular decision. So the early decision acceptance rate is probably a little bit higher, and we'll talk about that in a second. But the regular decisions rate is even lower, right? To make the average 4%. Now, of that 4%, that includes your legacies, right? And the kids who have affiliation with the school, and whether that's fair or unfair, we can debate that all day, but that is part of the number. You have your recruited athletes, right? The people like, myself back in the day that, for whatever reason, the school's like, oh, this is a student athlete that we want on board, and, we're going to get them to the door. And again, they count towards the acceptance rate, but they already know they're going to get accepted. And then, a couple other institutional factors. It's really, really, I don't want to throw the number out there, but it's just lower than 4%. So again, you put that into context. It's like, all right, if I'm a student and I do well in my school, do I have a chance? And it's, you have to be a little bit realistic. Everyone can reach really high. You're allowed to do that. You work throughout high school to kind of put yourself in a position to reach for a couple of schools, but you want to be able to say, 4%, I'm one of the best 25 students like in my grade, right? In this class, in this particular class, or I'm one of the top 5, top 10 kids in my year, in my grade, if that's 100 or 200 kids. Um, you know, you got to feel that about yourself. You got to kind of get a sense of whether your teachers feel that way about you, and the school, as an institution, maybe even your peers. And not to say that you can't get there, but that is the context. That's what the school is really looking for. And in Europe, we don't have class rank, right? We don't have the traditional, obviously some American schools, international schools have GPAs, but it's hard to kind of quantify where you stand. So just keep that in mind, like, where am I relative to my peers?
Josh, just before you just touch base on the sort of the second tier of schools that we've brought up on the slide now, so people can get an idea what's not all 4 or 5% acceptance rate. There are really great schools in the United States with healthier admissions rates. But can you just talk, and I know we'll talk about early decision as the conversation continues, but this idea of like going for the super reach in your early decision and how that probably is not a great strategy. And so when you look at early decision, early action, can you just sort of talk through the vernacular there, and give folks an idea like, okay, what is the strategy that we should be looking at for early decision? Because, as that is clearly something that moves the needle. But just talk through that really quick before we move to the next tier of schools.
For sure. So, like all this information, it's definitely case by case, right? But if we go with the kind of like ideal scenario, it's between two things. You choose your early decision on a school that you have a strong connection to, whether it's academic connection because you fit the profile really, really, really well. You're in the ACT, SAT range. Obviously, you have excellent grades. You may or may not have a connection to the school with the family. That doesn't really matter. I mean, it matters, but that doesn't have to be the breaking point. But you have to be a qualified student on paper first and foremost, based on data, right? And that's not me saying, hey, you can't. That's just knowing how comfortable you should feel. Now, some kids might say that and be like, I'm this close to that point. So if I use my early decision, it kind of closes that gap, right? And that's where the strategy comes into play of it's a gamble. Like that really is a gamble. If you're not quite there, but you think ED might help you get over the hump, like the gamble. Whereas if you could look at these types of schools, it's well, I know I'm in the range. I'm actually on the high side of the range, right? The upper quartile of the test scores. And by using my ED on a very, very good school like this, my confidence in getting in just goes up, pretty majorly, right? So that sometimes is just, less anxiety for a student, for the family. It's also sometimes a better fit school, like in the first place. It's kind of why the numbers all align. So you want to take that in consideration. You can just be done, right? You ED to one of these schools, and early decision essentially means if I apply to one school in the early round and I get accepted, I am signing a contract with my parents and my school that I will attend that university, right? It is a binding agreement, and the language in the agreement has gotten a little bit more intense over the years. So they're really buckling down on like kids not being able to kind of shift around. It's no, you're committing to that one school. Um, One recent trend that's kind of picked up in the last few years is we try to separate. There's an early decision in the early round, and then there's an early decision too in what's called now the regular round or the second round, or you can choose to name it however you want. So there's actually two cracks at early decision, which now again impacts the strategy, because you might say, oh, I go for this slightly super reach on the first one. If that doesn't go the way I want it, now I have to be more realistic and I go for the safe reach on the second one, right? So again, these are just parts of the strategy these days.
Yeah, it makes sense. Just out of curiosity, Josh, from your families and students who are applying from Europe to the US on this sort of secondary list of schools, again, these might not be schools that parents know right off the top of their head if they're not, sort of knowledgeable about US education. But is there one of the eight here that you see as the most popular destination for your European students? And just curious why.
Sure. So, I'm sure for London, it's not a shocker that NYU tends to be a very, very popular choice. Um, and it tends to work out in a certain way, right? It's, when someone has to explain why NYU, they're not going to just say, oh, like I live in a big city like London and New York is like the London of America. It's like, no, you got to get really, really thoughtful about why that's the right fit. But oftentimes it makes sense. So you can make it make sense. We see that, pretty popularly. And then Boston University is another one that's really creeped up in terms of people's like first choice now, because it's gotten so competitive. When their acceptance rate went from 75% to 25% in a matter of 20 years, right? So a completely different place than it was at the turn of the century. So a lot of schools are starting to trend to be more selective. And if you look now, George Washington, for example, I think historically people might have looked at it, maybe in the safety category, but slowly but surely it's becoming more of like a harder target to get into. And we have a lot of students there who are just loving it. And it's very, very international, very diverse as well. So that's another one that's really grown in popularity.
It is interesting to watch over the years how the schools move through sort of the tiers, right? And I think you're right that NYU is probably and BU is probably in this third tier that we're showing now. 5 to 10 years ago, they've moved up, and now I think it's probably reasonable to think that a Santa Clara GW is on the way into that second or even first tier. Um, Josh, I want to pivot the conversation just to keep it going and be respectful of people's times. We obviously have focused a lot of attention on early decision, if you're applying for those competitive schools as a way of sort of not gamifying the situation, but giving yourself really your best shot to get in. Two things really on this one is, I think the data in front of folks is very, very clear, right? You have a much better shot statistically to get in if you apply early decision. But speak specifically, Josh, about when you're having those conversations with your European clients, and especially during COVID, where, as you mentioned, they're not able to visit, and you're saying, well, listen, if you really want to go to Penn, you got a 15% chance in early, but only a 6% chance in regular. You got to put your best foot forward. And the kid, rightfully so, says, Josh, how do you expect me to commit to one school when I've not seen it, haven't had as much conversations? Those folks haven't come over here to our school. Just walk us through that talk track of, as you're thinking about your rising seniors applying, again, focusing on like, listen, if you really do want to put your best foot forward, you got to apply early decision. That does seem to continue to move the needle, but what's the frustration or hesitations from your students?
No, I saw it a lot this year. And again, like it's not our job to tell you, hey, like you need to apply to this school because XYZ. It's really helping kids develop a feeling of, oh, this feels like the right place for them, right? And that feeling can be different for everyone. So this year was weird because, I had students from UK and elsewhere apply to like, Tulane as like kind of their first choice, never having been to New Orleans, right? And I just happened to be in New Orleans and by Tulane today. Obviously schools like Bentley or Babson, American, Northeastern, Swarthmore, which are, again, these are all good schools. And they're going to these schools. Like they are actually going to these schools. This is this year's class. Very, very proud of them, very exciting. But it's also like they don't know what they're getting themselves into, but they did their research, right? They did their research, whether it's virtual tours, whether it's info sessions, whether it's with watching videos on YouTube or on Campus Reel, Instagram and Facebook, and have so much content now for, they're just trying to give you an idea of what it's like to be there. And then they're the best at this. Like they create their own little social groups, right? Instagram, IG chats, and they just get to kind of get a sense of, oh, this is what the kids would be like on that campus. And that tends to move the needle the most, right? Like I have kids who are still waiting on waiting lists and they're like, oh, maybe I should apply here and go for this. And then 2 weeks later, it's like, hey, I've met like 7 kids who are, gonna be in my class and they all look so cool. I'm actually fine. I don't need to, pursue the waiting list anymore. Right. And that's what you want to hear. It's like, oh, you feel excited about going to the school you got into.
Right. Right. So, we do focus a lot of the conversation on early decision. And, I think the positive attributes of early decision are kind of well known, right? Better acceptance rate, get in early, get this process behind you. But we don't really talk about sometimes why it is important. And this slide really does speak to the value of like what these colleges are essentially trying to do is fill up as much of their freshman class in their early round. I mean, pretty exceptional that at Colgate, Penn and Wash U in St. Louis, 60%, 50%, this is a big chunk of a freshman class being spoken for, before January 1st regular decision. So it does put the pressure, I think, Josh, on families to make that decision. Like, are we going to apply early decision? Or are we not? And this really just sort of validates, I think, what most people in admissions will say, that if you have a number one choice, if you're ready to apply, early decision can be a highly effective way, especially for international students. And this is the reason why.
Yeah. And it's important to note that like not every school offers early decision, right? We have families that come to us saying, oh, UCLA, UC Berkeley, top choice. Well, you can do early decision there. Obviously, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford, which are 4 of the arguably top schools, they have their own early action single choice. So, looking at the potential list of schools and how they all kind of approach dates and deadlines in their own way can also influence the decision process a bit, right? So, again, it's just important to be holistic about it and assess different options. Understand that one path might not be someone else's, but you got to know this stuff. You just have to kind of know this stuff.
That's right.
Over.
Josh, I want to talk a little bit about application timeline and what goes into that application. Obviously, with your experience working with international students from these international schools, the process is pretty different than what we have here in the United States. So let's just touch on sort of a handful of like the big ticket items that people need to be aware of. And the first of that is really just the coursework and grades. Talk a little bit about, what are you telling your students in terms of rigor of coursework and sort of, whether it be GCSEs or A levels or whatever, how are you helping them find that right balance between pushing themselves, but not, going over the edge? And then talk a little bit about sort of what your admissions contacts, are sharing with you about like the rigors of European school versus say the rigors of going to school here in Sacramento or Miami or Dallas.
Right. So for the sake of, I think the people on this call, we'll focus on A levels and IB, right? Obviously there are international schools that offer American AP curriculums, but we'll talk about IB. So in A levels. So 9th and 10th grade, matters. That's year 10 and year 11 in the UK. It matters. Not so much what classes you're taking, because obviously at GCSE, you're taking 9, 10, 11 courses, and you're going to get that full range. But the performance at the end of those GCSEs Even though they've been a little bit disturbed this year and obviously last year, that report, that GCSE report card, almost like the marks, that will matter because those will be the only solidified grades when you submit your application in the end, right? When you go into A levels, they're going to use your predicted A level grades. In the IB, there's a lot of talk about the IB. Is, what does the US think of the IB? And it's, well, since it's been out for 40, 50 plus years, it's been considered the global kind of bar for rigor. I'm a little bit biased, as obviously I took the IB myself and taught the IB, and I also taught AP, so I can kind of get a sense of the level of the work is just high on the IB, and it's a lot of research and it's a lot of writing, and again, it's a nice mixed bag of 6 core classes. But you gotta focus on the ones that you enjoy the most, right? As a young student, you gotta be willing to push yourself, but you don't have to push yourself everywhere. If you're gonna, if you don't like the sciences, you don't need to take advanced physics. It's just not, you don't have to do that. But if you do enjoy STEM, you gotta be willing to kind of push yourself a little bit. Okay, so that's the first piece of advice: is don't overload your schedule, but rigor is typically that first bar that they look at. But conveniently with the IB, you kind of pass that scale. If I'm an admissions officer looking at American students, I got to think about, okay, this many APs versus that many APs. And, oh, this school, most kids take 7 APs. This school, most kids take 3 APs. It's harder to really distinguish. With the IB, it's what's the predicted score out of 45, right? If you crack 40, you're in great shape. If you're a 44, 45, you're probably, you're top of the 0.01%, right? So just knowing that, I think is good to know, like, they value our education system.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. COVID not only just rearranged, courses and grades and exams and online learning versus in-person learning, but obviously had a lot to do with extracurricular activities, especially, specifically in places like Germany and the UK that have gone through a number of different lockdowns. What's the advice there for students, especially going into this summer where things seem to be lightening up a little bit? A lot of in the US in terms of like summer programs have canceled and gone online, but Josh, how are you advising, your students specifically? Like, how do you go out and get involved and show your interests when so many things during COVID have been, essentially closed?
Yeah, this has been the part that you feel for the most for the kids. Obviously, you work hard at school. Sometimes you just want to look forward to rehearsing for a play that you get to put on for the school and for your family and friends. Obviously, sports leagues and competitions kind of, not being able to develop and progress at their usual rate. So we get it, and I think obviously admissions officers get it, that if you're a rising senior right now, you're going to have a little bit of a lighter, profile extracurricularly than in years past. But still, were you creative? Were you innovative in a way? Right? Were you able to make the most out of a obviously real tough situation? And we've seen that. We've seen kids, whether they into computer science or just learning about computer science because they knew they're going to be in front of computers more, and getting into programming and developing their skill set there, and that opening the door to engineering. We've seen students really get creative with volunteering opportunities and, remotely coordinating things and taking leadership roles in that regard. Societies that were on Zoom, obviously it's harder to get kids in attendance, but if you push it the right way, you organize it the right way, you create the right incentive, you invite the right guest speaker, that's one part that's been easier to set up, right? Is getting guest speakers to come in. And you've seen kids really get people to show up for those type of events. So, there's still things out there. And I think it's also about planning, looking ahead and knowing, okay, once things are open, here's what I'm going to prioritize. I always tell kids you have around 40 hours of free time in a week. How are you using that time? No one's saying you have to go 40 for 40, like max it out, but quarter of the time, half the time, just doing things that you feel like, I enjoyed that, it was productive, and I'm getting better at something. And that can be different for everyone.
Yep, super helpful. Just a quick word on demonstrated interest, Josh. Obviously, a little bit of that is, did you apply early decision? Did you visit campus? Obviously, not as many people are doing that as, at this time. But it does seem that this whole admissions game has really become more of almost like a dating process where it's like, do you like us? Do we like you? And in a lot of ways, the feedback that we hear from schools is, well, we don't want to make an offer to a student if we think that that student is definitely going to say no. We want to know that they're going to consider our offer and potentially accept it, because we want to protect our yield, i.e. the number of kids we accept versus the number of kids who actually enroll. So again, you're living abroad, you've been through 2 or 3 lockdowns, you're now applying to college, you're an international kid. You can't just get in the car and drive and see a bunch of universities like your peers here in the US can. Quick suggestions, thoughts on what families and students should be doing for that?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing is, so as recent as like a month ago, it seemed like colleges were not having campus tours over the summer. And then more and more started like saying, hey, we're all, you can have a self-guided tour and we can give you a list of kind of points to hit. So you can go on campus now. And if you do that and you don't do an official tour as part of like, the admissions office's tour, I'm encouraging students to just email the admissions officer and telling them like, hey, quick introduction from obviously this part of the world. And I'm going to be on campus doing a self-guided tour. I'm into these things. I figured I'm going to go see these 2, 3 places. Is there anywhere else I should go see? Right. And it's such like not like you're really, really going for it. It's a candid email. Just, I want to make sure that there's something I don't miss. They might get back to you. They might not. Right. Like they get a lot of those emails. Doesn't matter. You can email them afterwards and be like, hey, it was a great time, blah, blah, blah. If you are ever in the UK or in Europe, like, please, let us know. And again, we don't know how they file those emails necessarily, but that's still something worth doing. And then obviously anything you register for, like a virtual tour or an info session virtually, that does go into some kind of system. We don't think that, hey, just by doing that, it automatically means you're in. But it just shows that if you've had an engagement with the school for 2, 3 years, then you apply there, even in the regular round, for whatever reason, you might still have just a slight advantage over a kid who's just like never, ever had contact with them. Right.
Right.
And
Just
that's
trying to check as many boxes as possible.
exactly, exactly.
Yeah. Okay, super helpful. Last one we'll talk about on this slide, and then we'll talk about the other issues as we wrap up our conversation. But obviously, Josh, this has been the hot button topic. I'll spare all of our clients and the people on this call my rant about SAT and ACT and let them have your guidance. But international student, do I take the SAT or ACT? Yes or no?
Yes. And it's not just because we want kids to spend hours just like worrying about this test. Um, you know, is there a future where they might not be as important? Potentially. Were they not that important this year? That's false. They were still very, very important, right? Even though this year they was test optional, even though students to do 50% only submitted test scores, you still saw you were an increase in likelihood of getting in if you submitted test scores, right? It's in the student's best interest to have a test score within the range. So just knowing that, if other kids see test optional and decide, oh, that means I don't have to take it, I don't have to worry about it, I can, just remove that barrier to entry. That's fine in some cases, but in most cases, you still should kind of go for it because it's a data point, right? And when you have thousands and thousands of applications, all you're looking for is some type of help to be like, how do I tell that Josh is, slightly behind Billy, right? And that score still matters. And I know these admissions officers are just like looking forward to getting back to the normal cycle of, especially for the class of 2023, that's when we assume they'll kind of be back to normal. There are whispers of some schools creating their own tests, whether it's the UC test or the IV test. Whispers or rumors we're not going to focus on until they actually become factual. And right now, the fact is that the ACT and SAT still matter.
The takeaway I hear there, Josh, is if you're applying to selective universities and you can get a top score, get a top score. Don't leave anything to chance.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense. Josh, let's transition to the application itself. So, the kids done the hard work. They have, gotten really great grades. They've done their extracurricular. They've come up with the college list. And now they're actually sitting down and starting that process of, writing the essays and filling out the Common App. And Josh, you are, over the last 7, 8 years, I've seen you craft great stories and narratives of your students. Can you just give us that holistic approach? Like, how do you develop that hook? How can parents start to have that conversation with their student, right? How
Yeah,
do they start to, like, not without being too pushy, and how kids get with their parents, but like, how do you say, listen, here's some leading questions you can ask
right.
that can get them thinking about what they may want to talk about in their essay?
So like, I use the word passion probably a little bit too much in my conversations with kids, where I want to make them understand that passion doesn't mean like this is what I do every single day of my life and nothing else matters. It's just, what is the thing that you're most excited about, right? It could be academic, it could be social, it could be athletic, it could be a number of different things. But whatever it is what are different ways we can branch it out, right? And I use basketball as my example. It's like, okay, I played basketball, that's cool. It's like, okay, like, you play for your school, you play for your club, maybe, if you play good enough, you can expand and travel, sure. But for me, basketball was, the way that I made friends, right? It was like my closest relationships. It's the way that I learned how to be part of a team. That's, again, the same for most people. But I also saw it as the way I could impact others. Just in a small school, not many people where I was at played basketball. So I wanted to like coach younger kids and teach them really, the ways that the basketball could really like provide excitement and all these different things. So um, yeah, just keeping that in mind that, I was able to start a basketball camp when I was 15, 16 years old and get kids to kind of sign up and come on weekends. And I see my,
Yeah, we still got you, Josh.
okay, sorry. But then for someone else, it could be musically related, right? And it's like, well, I like listening to music, I like playing music, and then eventually I like studying music, and eventually I like making music, and eventually I like sharing music, right? And next thing you know, just your love of music has taught you a lot about who you are, right? Has helped you conquer fears, has helped you meet new people, um, you know, spent time on crafting your own skill, outside of the required time. And that's what they want to hear, right? They want to hear what's the thing that's actually going to make you, happy to get up on a Sunday morning and work on it. And again, for everyone else, that's a different story. So what I help do, what we talk about is just connecting the different dots. How does ninth grade summer connect to 11th grade summer, connect to, what you're doing on a Wednesday after school, right? They're all part of the same narrative. The kids sometimes don't really realize like, oh, that's the writing on the wall.
Right, right. Um, the logistics on the personal statement, Josh, 650 words for the Common App, which was what most people will use. And then each school has that individual sort of set of questions. And I think that the personal statement one is the one where you obviously spend a lot of time talking about your passion, talking about your interest, talking about what kind of makes you tick. But maybe just a quick word on those specific, like the NYU questions or the Harvard questions or the Duke questions. Maybe just since those are so much shorter and tighter in terms of word count, you got to really be on point. Maybe just talk through just quickly, like, especially as an international student who hasn't seen the campus in most cases, what are the types of things that people should be focused on when they're writing those specific essays? Is it programs, professors, class? Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think this is where, you know, Googling, how do I write a supplement essay can get a kid in trouble because, yes, sometimes name dropping a professor can help, but only if it makes sense, right? And what I mean by that is the things that you've done before you apply, right? Your experiences match with what the school can offer, their resources, their classes, whatever it may be. That has to go together, right? It has to be a straight kind of like progression of like, I've done this for the last few years and your school offers XYZ. That's why I want to do it. Right. And it makes sense. And you can then obviously talk about, and later on, it's going to lead to, this profession or this initiative I want to launch. So the school can kind of be like, oh, you've spent time thinking about this. you figured out that we're the right fit for that particular scenario, and the school might get something out of it down the line as well, right? So, you want to just show that kind of initiative. um you don't want to talk about the general vague things like, oh, it's a beautiful campus, or it's in the city. You got to get very, very specific. If you're going to talk about joining clubs, it's, well, which club? And again, what have you done in the past that links to that? Or why is that a new, interest and curiosity of yours? Like, where is that coming from? So authenticity is the key here, and obviously doing a little bit of research to go with it, is a good look.
Got it. As we sort of start to wind down the conversation, and Josh, again, thanks so much for the incredible expertise here. Um, Even though you're applying to the same schools, every time I hear you talk, it just gives me, uh, it shows me how much it is different for international kids who are not here in the U.S. versus the kids who are here who are applying to these schools that they can often, walk down the street or drive just a short way and see and touch and feel it, and really does help them in shaping their application. Letters of reference, recommendation letters, those seem to be becoming more and more important with more and more schools offering them. Wondering if you can just share the recommendation letter part, how do kids think about that process? And then if you could just tie in, obviously, one of the one of the positive byproducts of COVID has been that pretty much all the schools have now started to unveil or roll out virtual interviews versus like having to meet, if there's not someone in my local market, I don't get to have an interview. Now everybody seems to be doing more and more Zoom interviews. And obviously that's been a significant positive for international students where interviewing wasn't as positive or common. Can you just talk about those two and the
Right.
importance of those two, and how that sort of works in tandem?
Yeah. So if we just kind of take like a bird's eye view, right? You have your academic profile, you have your extracurricular profile, but probably the most important thing is, what do adults think of you, right? Adults that we ideally can trust. And in this case, it's a school counselor, and then at least one or two teachers, and then maybe an additional recommender that could be a coach. It could be someone from, like, the church or the synagogue. It could be an employer from a work experience. But adults that had a chance to kind of see you on usually a long-term basis, right? They have an identity. They have a sense of your identity. They have a sense of your character, kind of who you are. And again, if they can connect more dots, right? So it's just almost validating what we've said in the application, or, maybe they're adding another anecdote to, an experience that you've mentioned in your activities. And again, it's just giving us that insight into, this is why this kid is special, right? It's not just, oh, they're a good student, or they come from a good family. It's no, no, no. Why will you remember this particular student if they ever came back to campus years from now? And again, I've had to, it's flattering to be, by the way, asked to write a recommendation for a kid, right? And obviously, I was a basketball coach for high school for a long time, so got to write a lot of these, and it's, I take time writing them and really saying, like, this is why this kid is a kid I'm always going to remember for these little, anecdotal reasons. And that's why it's encourage students to, like, be open to developing a relationship with your teacher, right? Don't be afraid to go talk to the school counselor unannounced and knock on the door and just say, hey, can I get 5 minutes of your time? Just want to update you. I visited XYZ schools over the last couple of weeks, or I'm like, I'm looking into these schools. I feel like there's still too much of a divide between, administration and students. But when it comes to the college process, like, you have to take agency, right? And obviously, we're here to help you feel that it's okay to do that, but taking control of your future at 16, 17 is just like the best kind of thing to do. So again, don't be afraid to go talk to the English teacher. You don't feel like you have to have math and sciences if you're going to be an engineer. You can just, whichever teacher knows you best, that's who you talk to. And then
That's
the interview piece, that part we really want to, like, not even demystify, but it's not like a UK interview, right? It's not where they're going to quiz you on your knowledge. Like, oh, you say you want to do computer science. Like, tell us about, how do you write code in R, right? It's, again, just getting a sense of who you are, what you're into. And like you said, these virtual interviews, they just want to really market the school. All they want you to do is apply. Like, that's what the initial little interviews are for. And then the interview after you apply is more about, was your application sincere, right? Like, are you a real person? Because again, we want to make sure that everyone that applies actually is who they say they are. So it's a lot less stressful than I think, the word interview usually implies. It's not make or break ever. It's more, oh, an informal chat and I can have a conversation with an adult.
Got it. Josh, super helpful. I want to thank again everybody for joining us across Europe. Nice to see so many familiar faces in the attendee list. And Josh, a big thank you to you for all the work that you're doing and your expertise specifically on international students applying. I know we're going to circulate the deck as well as the video to folks. Any kind of parting words for those families who are going through this for the first time and going to be sending off applications in the fall or the year after? Just sort of any final word of wisdom?
Yeah. What I often find myself repeating now, it's that, I understand that this process can bring about, nerves, and obviously you have to, book flights, and sometimes, there's a lot that goes into it. But the part where students feel anxious is kind of like, not knowing where they're going to be after high school, right? Their whole life's kind of been set up where it's like, oh, you're going to go here, you don't have much say. And then all of a sudden, after 18, it's like you're on your own, right? And not everyone's always ready for that at, 15, 16, having those conversations. But just letting them know that they're going to go to a good school, right? Like 100% of the time, they go to a good school. Like that's just the reality. So you don't have to worry about like, am I going to get in? Am I going to get in? You're going to get in. You're going to get into a good school. Is it Stanford or Harvard, MIT? We don't know, but you're going to get into a good school, and it's usually going to be the right fit place that's going to make you the happiest. So just trusting that even though this process is crazy and entails so much, but it's going to work out. I feel like everyone can just breathe a little sigh of relief.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Josh,
Oh,
thanks again.
really, thank you, man. Thank you. You know that obviously a lot of what I know is thanks to thanks to you. But no, thank you to everyone obviously for making the call on Sunday. It's been a pleasure. And if you have any questions, obviously you guys know you can email me, text me, call me anytime. And hope everyone's gonna have a great summer.
Great. Thanks, Josh. See you, everybody.
Bye, everyone.